The December rain didn't fall tonight. It attacked. Sharp needles of water hurled themselves against the windows of the Willow Lantern, a little riverside diner on the quieter edge of Portland. Inside, the air glowed gold and smelled of cinnamon, butter, and coffee. Outside, the world was gray and merciless. When the door swung open, the storm followed a man in a navy overcoat and a small girl clutching his hand. Ethan Caldwell. 39 years old, founder of the fastest-growing biotech company on the West Coast, and a man who looked as if he hadn't slept in 7 years. His eyes were the color of rain-soaked stone, his expression something between exhaustion and defiance. He bent down, adjusting the tiny gray cardigan on his daughter. "Almost there, Sophie," he murmured. His voice was low, careful, as if even sound might break her. Sophie Caldwell, age 7, didn't respond. She didn't look up. Her hands clutched an old stuffed rabbit whose fur had worn thin, the kind of toy that had absorbed too many tears and too many silent nights. Her brown hair stuck to her cheeks in damp strands. Her shoes squeaked faintly on the polished floor. They didn't look like father and daughter out for dinner. They looked like two survivors walking out of a wreck that never quite ended. The hostess recognized Ethan immediately. Everyone in Portland's business circle did, but the sight of the child made her falter. "Table for two, Mr. Caldwell?" He nodded without meeting her eyes. "A quiet corner, please." The hostess led them to a booth near the back, where the rain's drumming softened into a kind of rhythm. Ethan helped Sophie slide into the seat, placing her rabbit beside her like a fragile companion. He tried to smile, but it came out as a grimace, a man trying to remember what smiles were made of. For 3 years, he'd done everything humanly possible to help his daughter speak again. Doctors, neurologists, child therapists, experimental programs, each promising hope, each ending in quiet despair. Nothing worked. Sophie's silence had become a second language, one he still couldn't translate. He loosened his tie, exhaled, and signaled for the server. She appeared quietly, almost blending into the warm glow of the diner. A young woman, mid-20s, in a simple uniform, black slacks, white shirt, gray apron tied neatly at the waist. Light brown hair gathered into a loose bun, a few strands escaping around her face. Clara Monroe. There was something about the way she moved, not hurried, not timid, just aware. Every step measured, every glance thoughtful, as though she was reading the room without needing to ask. "Good evening," she said softly. "Welcome to the Willow Lantern." Her voice was warm but light, like the sound of rain on paper. Ethan looked up briefly, about to rattle off an order, when she lowered herself slightly, so that her eyes were level with Sophie's. "Hi there," she said gently. "You must be Sophie." No reaction. Sophie's gaze stayed locked on the window, watching droplets race down the glass. Clara didn't push. She didn't reach out or fill the silence with forced cheer like so many adults did around quiet children. Instead, she smiled faintly. "I'm Clara," she continued, her tone calm, melodic. "You don't have to talk to me. I'll just make sure you're warm, okay?" Still no response. But Sophie's shoulders shifted ever so slightly, as if she had heard. Ethan frowned, impatient. "She doesn't really—" But Clara wasn't listening to him. She was already moving toward the counter. A minute later, she returned with a mug of hot cocoa, steam curling like breath in winter air. Tiny marshmallows floated on top, arranged carefully into a small, smiling face. Clara set it down in front of the girl, not sliding it toward her, just placing it within reach, quiet as a secret. "Careful," she murmured. "It's a little hot." Then she stepped back, giving space. Sophie didn't move at first. Then slowly, she tilted her head. Her eyes, big and brown and full of distant weather, shifted from the window to the mug, just a glance. But Ethan froze. He had seen hundreds of specialists chase that same reaction for months, call her name, show flashcards, play sound recordings, and nothing. But this stranger, with a cup of cocoa and no expectations, had earned a flicker of attention. Clara didn't seem to notice her small victory. She only smiled softly, as though she'd been waiting for the world to slow down long enough for Sophie to exist in it. Ethan's throat tightened. "Thank you," he muttered, more reflex than gratitude. She nodded. "Would you like to order, Mr. Caldwell?" He cleared his throat, switching into the efficient tone of a man who solved problems with control. "She'll have the grilled cheese, no butter, and plain tomato soup." He hesitated, then added quietly, "She doesn't like surprises." Clara scribbled the note. "And for you?" "Coffee, black." "Of course." But she didn't leave right away. Her gaze drifted back to Sophie, not with pity, but curiosity, recognition, maybe even tenderness. Then she stepped away, letting them return to their private silence. Ethan leaned back, eyes on his daughter. She was staring at the cocoa again, tracing the marshmallow face with her eyes. He thought of all the things he'd been told. Don't let her isolate. Engage with her constantly. Reward eye contact. Track verbal responses. 100 protocols. None of them had worked. Now, watching Sophie and that small mug between them, Ethan felt something he hadn't in months. Not progress, not science, something far more dangerous. Hope. He looked toward the counter where Clara stood entering orders into the screen, her expression quiet and focused. There was a steadiness about her that made him uneasy, like someone who'd learned peace the hard way. The rain outside eased, turning into a soft percussion. Sophie lifted her hand, touched the side of the mug, and for the first time in 3 years, Ethan saw curiosity in her eyes. He swallowed hard, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. And somewhere in the golden quiet of that little diner, a man who built his empire on solving the unsolvable realized he had just met the one person who might rewrite the rules. The waitress who didn't ask questions, the girl who didn't speak, and the father who, for the first time in years, dared to believe that maybe silence wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. The rain softened outside the willow lantern, trading its fury for a steady whisper. Inside, the air was warm with butter and quiet jazz. At table 12, Ethan Caldwell sat watching the young waitress as if she were an equation he couldn't solve. He'd met every expert in the country, people with titles, graphs, and explanations. They all began the same way. What's her diagnosis? What medication is she on? But this woman hadn't asked a single question. She simply made space. Clara moved calmly between tables, her eyes always noticing, never intruding. Sophie sat in silence, holding her cocoa as though it were a living thing. The marshmallow smile had melted, but the little girl kept watching it, tracing the edge of the mug with her thumb. Ethan leaned forward. "You like that, sweetheart?" Sophie didn't respond, but her thumb moved again. That was something, more than he'd had in months. He looked at the waitress. She was kneeling to pick up a napkin someone had dropped, smiling faintly at a baby in another booth. Ordinary, unremarkable, but calm in a way that made him feel unsteady. When she returned, he spoke before thinking. "Clara, right?" She nodded. "That's me." "You're good with kids." She shrugged lightly. "Not really. I just try not to scare them." Ethan frowned. "Scare them?" She met his gaze. "Most adults are too loud. They fill silence because they can't stand it. But silence can be safe, Mr. Caldwell." He didn't know how to answer. No one talked to him like that, softly, yet without fear. He lowered his voice. "We've been everywhere. Language specialists, therapists, clinics. My daughter hasn't spoken to a single person in 3 years." Clara looked at Sophie. "Maybe she doesn't trust words anymore." "What does that mean?" "When words are used to explain pain instead of heal it, you stop believing in them." Her words sank like stones in water. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Ethan did what powerful men often do when logic fails them. He reached for his wallet. "I'll make this simple," he said quietly. "If you can help my daughter talk again, communicate like any normal child, I'll buy you a house, anywhere you want, in your name." Clara blinked. "A house?" "Yes, paid in full, no strings attached." It didn't sound arrogant, just desperate. A father trying to buy a miracle because money was the only language he spoke fluently. Clara didn't move. Her expression stayed calm, but something in her eyes hardened. "You're trying to purchase something that can't be bought." "I'm asking for help," he said. "Then ask," she replied. Her tone was gentle, but the message hit him harder than he expected. He hesitated. "Please, help her." Clara exhaled softly. "I can't promise that, but I can try to understand what she's afraid of." Ethan frowned. "Afraid of?" "She doesn't need to be fixed, Mr. Caldwell. She needs to feel safe enough to be herself." He studied her, uncertain whether to feel anger or awe. For years, people had given him polished theories. She gave him the one thing they never had: honesty. Sophie stirred the cocoa again, watching the swirl of brown and white. "She's communicating already," Clara said. Just not with words. Ethan's shoulders slumped. You really think you can reach her? I don't know, Clara admitted, but I won't make her talk. I'll wait until she wants to. That answer, so simple, so infuriating, disarmed him completely. He was used to deals, deadlines, guarantees. She was offering none, only patience. Clara tucked her notepad into her apron. If I agree, we do this my way. No doctors, no cameras, just her, me, and time. Ethan's instinct rebelled. He didn't trust anyone with Sophie, yet something about Clara's calm made his protests dissolve before they reached his mouth. He nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Clara smiled faintly. Just don't interrupt when she finds her voice. Ethan wanted to argue that he wasn't the problem, that he'd done everything, paid everyone, but he stopped himself. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been the loudest noise in Sophie's silent world. As Clara turned to walk away, her reflection caught in the window beside Sophie's. For a moment, the two figures, one small, one grown, merged in the glass. Ethan watched, breath shallow, a strange thought forming in the back of his mind. Maybe this waitress wasn't a stranger at all. Maybe she was exactly who his daughter had been waiting for. He stared at the faint trail of steam rising from Sophie's cocoa, the smell of chocolate, the low hum of rain, the calm presence of a woman who didn't treat silence like a flaw. Everything about the moment felt fragile, precious. He whispered under his breath, more to himself than to God, "Please, let this work." And as if the universe had heard, Sophie lifted her head for half a second, eyes catching Clara's figure across the room before drifting back to the mug. A tiny, fleeting spark. But to Ethan Caldwell, it was the first sunrise after a very long night. The rain outside the willow lantern had turned from a storm into a steady drizzle, like the city was sighing after holding its breath too long. The streets glimmered beneath the dim glow of street lamps. Inside, the dinner rush had ended. Tables were half empty. A faint jazz song hummed through the old speakers. Ethan Caldwell sat alone at the table, watching the drops slide down the glass. Sophie had fallen asleep in the car an hour ago. He'd let her stay there, wrapped in her little gray blanket, under the watch of his driver. Now, it was just him, and the woman who had managed to shift the axis of his world in one evening, Clara Monroe. She stood by the counter, untying her apron, unaware, or perhaps very aware, that his eyes had been following her. Ethan wasn't used to being ignored. In boardrooms, his presence silenced arguments. His signature decided careers. When he spoke, people adjusted their posture, recalibrated their tone, waited for approval. But this woman, she'd looked him in the eye, listened to his offer worth more than most people would make in a lifetime, and simply said no. He didn't remember the last time someone had told him no. She noticed him watching now and approached, her steps quiet on the old floorboards. "You're still here," she said simply. He nodded. "You didn't answer my offer." "I did," she said softly. "You just didn't like the answer." Her calm infuriated him, and yet he couldn't look away. "You don't understand," he began. "I'm not exaggerating when I make promises like that. When I say I'll buy you a house, I mean it. I always keep my word. I'm sure you do." She folded her apron neatly on the counter. "But some things aren't about keeping promises. They're about why you make them." Ethan frowned. "You think I'm trying to buy redemption?" Clara looked up at him, really looked. "No," she said. "I think you're trying to buy peace, and peace doesn't come in real estate." For a man who built empires on logic, her words landed like a blow. He opened his mouth, then closed it. No one ever spoke to him that way. Not board members, not rivals, not even his ex-wife. She picked up her coat, clearly signaling the conversation was over, but Ethan wasn't ready to let it end. "Wait," he said, standing. "How long have you worked here?" 6 months. "And before that?" Her hand froze on her coat button for just a moment. Then she smiled politely. "Before that doesn't matter." It did. He could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened, the brief flicker in her eyes. There was a story there. He didn't know what it was, but it was heavy. He took a slow step closer. "You're not just a waitress?" She gave a small, amused exhale. "Everyone says that when they see someone doing something they can't imagine themselves doing." He almost smiled at that. "You don't belong here." "Neither do you," she replied. "You're dressed like the rain's your enemy." He looked down at his soaked overcoat, then at her. She had a point. Clara glanced toward the door. "You should get home. Sophie needs you rested." That hit him harder than she knew. Rested. The word didn't exist in his vocabulary. "How much sleep do you get, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "What? How many hours? 2, 3? The question disarmed him. No one asked him about his health. They asked about revenue, investments, philanthropic initiatives, but not him. He hesitated. 4, maybe. "Then you're trying to heal her with an empty tank." He didn't answer. For the first time in a long time, he had no defense. She gave a small, kind smile. Children feel what their parents don't say. If you're running on fumes, she's inhaling the smoke. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, his hand pressed against the wood, veins standing out. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her she didn't know what it was like, losing his wife to ambition, his daughter to silence, himself to guilt. But somehow, looking at her calm, steady face, the words wouldn't come. She finally reached for her umbrella. "I'm not saying I can help, Sophie," she said softly, "but if I were to try, it wouldn't be here." He lifted his eyes. "Where then?" Clara hesitated at the door. The rain had started again, silver under the streetlight. Someplace simple, no suits, no expensive watches, just you and her. Ethan tilted his head. "And you?" A brief flicker crossed her eyes, something between caution and curiosity. "If you insist." He allowed himself a breath. "When?" She turned the doorknob. "When you're willing to stop being CEO Ethan Caldwell and start being Sophie's dad." The words hung between them, sharp and kind all at once. He didn't answer. She stepped outside, umbrella blooming open like a black flower against the mist. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her walk down the wet street. Then, impulsively, he followed her out into the alley behind the diner. Rain spattered his face, cold and cleansing. Clara turned, startled but not frightened. "You really don't take no for an answer, do you?" she said. He gave a humorless smile. "Not usually. Maybe you should start." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "You're asking me to strip away everything I've built, to show up without armor. That's not who I am." Clara's gaze softened. Then maybe that's why she stopped talking. That one landed, hard. For a long, suspended moment, there was only rain, the sound of it pooling at their feet, reflecting the diner's neon sign in fractured colors. Finally, Ethan nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Tell me where to be." Clara watched him carefully, as though testing whether the man in front of her could keep a promise without writing a contract. "Greenway Park," she said, "by the duck pond. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. No driver, no assistance, just you and Sophie." He exhaled slowly, nodding once. "I'll be there." She studied him for a second longer, then gave a small, approving nod. "Good. Then we'll start from silence." Clara turned and walked into the rain. Her figure blurred into the silver mist until she disappeared completely. Ethan stood there, coat soaked, shoes heavy, the city around him humming with rain and uncertainty. For the first time in years, he'd agreed to something without knowing the outcome. And somehow, it felt like the only honest decision he'd made in a very long time. The next afternoon, the city smelled of rain and cedar. The storm had passed, leaving a pale silver sky that hung low over the Willamette River. The air carried that quiet hum that always followed a long night of thunder, like the world was catching its breath. Ethan Caldwell parked his car near the old dock Clara had mentioned. It wasn't a place he'd ever been before. The boardwalk was uneven, framed by weeping willows and faded benches. Ducks drifted lazily on the gray water, occasionally breaking the reflection of clouds. He checked his watch, 3 o'clock sharp. Clara was already there. She wore a cream-colored sweater and jeans, her hair loose and a little messy, as if the wind had been playing with it. In her hand was a small tote bag. When she saw them, she smiled. Not the polite kind, but something real, gentle, grounded. Sophie clung to his hand as they approached. The little girl's small boots left perfect prints on the damp concrete. Her stuffed rabbit peeked from under her arm. Clara knelt down, meeting Sophie's eyes but not closing the distance. "Hi, Sophie," she said softly. "I'm glad you came." Sophie didn't answer, but she blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Clara smiled as if that was enough. "Would you like to sit?" She spread a wool blanket across the low stone ledge near the river. It was old but clean, patterned with faint red lines that reminded Ethan of something handmade, something cared for. From the tote bag she took out a few items, a blank sketchbook, a small box of colored pencils, and nothing else. No toys, no puzzles, no flashcards, just color and space. Ethan hesitated behind them. "Don't you need—" Clara turned slightly, still calm. No, we're not testing her. We're sharing time. Her tone was so steady that he didn't argue. He stepped back into a nearby railing, close enough to see, far enough to obey her unspoken rule. This was Sophie's moment. Clara sat cross-legged beside the girl, leaving a respectful gap of space. You know, she began conversationally, I used to hate the rain. Sophie's head tilted, just barely. Every time it rained, Clara continued, I thought the sky was scolding me, like it was saying, you should have done better. She smiled faintly. Then one day, someone told me rain isn't angry, it's just heavy. The sky gets too full and it has to let go. So, maybe it's not scolding, it's healing. Sophie's fingers twitched against her rabbit's ear. Her eyes drifted toward the colored pencils, their bright shades like tiny promises of warmth against the dull gray day. Clara didn't push. She just opened the sketchbook and began to draw slowly, casually. When I don't have words, she said, I draw circles. Big ones, small ones. They remind me that even when things fall apart, they can still come back around. Ethan watched from the distance, his heart caught somewhere between disbelief and hope. This wasn't therapy as he'd seen it before. No clinical tone, no coaxing, just presence. Clara placed a few colored pencils on the blanket between them. Blue, yellow, green. She didn't point, she didn't invite. She simply existed in the same space, waiting. Minutes passed. The wind stirred Sophie's hair. A duck quacked in the distance. The river kept moving, quiet and unhurried. Finally, Sophie reached out. Her small hand hovered over the pencils, trembling slightly before settling on one. Blue. She held it awkwardly, then touched it to the page. A single mark, a circle, uneven and shy. Then another stroke, small rays stretching outward like sunbeams. Clara didn't react, didn't praise her, didn't make the moment heavy with celebration. She just watched, eyes soft. That's a beautiful blue, she murmured, barely audible. Sophie's mouth moved a little, like she was thinking of a word but couldn't quite catch it. Then she pressed harder, making the color deeper. The page filled slowly with imperfect rays, one after another, each one like a tiny act of courage. Ethan's breath caught. It wasn't a word, it wasn't speech, but it was a voice, a visual one, fragile and pure. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white. Something inside him cracked open, a soundless sob rising from a place he hadn't visited in years. Clara turned slightly toward him. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just met his eyes across the gray distance, as if to say, see? She's still here. And he did see. For the first time in 3 years, he saw not the silence, but the child inside it. They stayed that way for almost an hour. Clara kept drawing, small shapes that connected with Sophie's. A sun, a few ducks, lines of water. She told small stories between them, half-whispered thoughts about how ducks don't care if the sky is gray, they swim anyway, how blue isn't a sad color, it's the color of breathing. Sophie listened, her face softened, her hand never left the pencil. Ethan stood there the whole time, unable to look away. The city felt distant. The noise of traffic was muted, replaced by the rhythmic scratch of pencil on paper. He realized then that Clara hadn't tried to fix Sophie. She had simply joined her where she was. No expectations, no commands, no reward systems, just connection. When the hour passed, Clara finally closed the sketchbook gently. I think that's enough for today, she said quietly. Sophie didn't resist when Clara packed up. But as the woman folded the blanket, the little girl did something small and extraordinary. She reached out and brushed her fingers over Clara's sleeve, just once, like a whisper of trust. Clara froze for a heartbeat, then smiled softly, tucking the moment somewhere deep inside her. Thank you, Sophie, she whispered. Ethan turned away before they could see the wetness in his eyes. He pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting the flood of emotion. For 3 years, he'd lived with a silence so absolute it felt eternal. Yet here, in a park by a gray river, that silence had cracked, just enough for light to spill through. As they walked back toward the car, Sophie clutched the rabbit in one hand and the sketchbook in the other. Ethan glanced down. The page on top showed the blue circle, the tiny sun. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. But in that fragile drawing, he saw everything he had been waiting for. The proof that his daughter still wanted to speak. She just needed the right language, and maybe the right person, to help her find it again. He looked back once more. Clara stood by the water's edge, watching. The ducks float downstream, the wind tugging gently at her hair. She didn't wave, she didn't call out. She just waited until Sophie looked over her shoulder and met her eyes. That was enough. 2 days after the Riverside meeting, Ethan Caldwell sat in the back of his car, watching Portland blur past in streaks of gray and gold. His phone buzzed once, an encrypted message from his private investigator. He opened it. A single line appeared. Clara Monroe, formerly Child Trauma Intervention Specialist, Portland Community Crisis Center. Resigned 3 years ago after the death of a minor named Lily Rhodes. No record since. Ethan read it twice, his throat tightening. He scrolled further down the file. News clippings, old photographs, a single image of Clara in a white sweater beside a group of children drawing under a banner that read, "Healing Through Color." She looked younger, lighter, the same woman, but brighter before something had broken. And then the headline. Community program shuts down after tragic loss of 6-year-old participant. He stared at it for a long moment, then shut the file. The world outside the car kept moving, but something in him stilled. He'd thought he understood her, thought her quiet strength came from discipline, not pain. But now he wasn't so sure. That evening, when he drove to the Willow Lantern, the rain had returned, thin, relentless, needling at the edges of his patience. Clara was outside, locking up the side door, her hair pulled back loosely, the kind of tired grace that never quite disappeared. "Clara," he called softly. She froze, keys halfway turned, before facing him. "Mr. Caldwell." Her tone wasn't cold, just cautious, like she already knew what was coming. Ethan stepped closer, hands deep in his coat pockets. "I found out where you used to work." The stillness that followed was sharper than the rain. Her voice came quiet but steady. "You had someone look into me." "I had to," he said. "You spend time with my daughter. I needed to know who you are." "And now you do," she said simply, turning back to the door. He moved closer. "You helped kids who stopped speaking, didn't you? Like Sophie." Clara didn't respond. The only sound was the click of the lock and the distant hum of passing traffic. "One of them was named Lily," he continued. Stop." Her voice wasn't loud, but it sliced clean through the rain. She turned slowly to face him, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Don't say her name like you have the right to." Ethan hesitated. "Do you have any idea," she whispered, "what it's like to promise a child you'll keep them safe and then fail?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Clara exhaled shakily, leaning against the doorframe. The tiredness around her eyes wasn't from lack of sleep. It was the exhaustion of someone carrying too much for too long. "She was 7, Clara said, voice trembling at first, then steadying. "Same age as Sophie, bright, quiet, terrified of her own voice. Her father had—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "She'd been through things no child should. And I believed, if I could just be patient, she'd start to trust again." Rain ran down her sleeves as she spoke, drops clinging to her trembling hands. "Then one night, Lily's mother called me," Clara continued. "She said Lily had locked herself in the bathroom. I told her to wait. I said forcing the door could break the fragile progress we'd made, that sometimes children just needed space to breathe." Her eyes lifted to Ethan's, raw and hollow. When they finally broke it open, it was too late. The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to speak, to say it wasn't her fault, to offer comfort, but Clara shook her head before he could. "Don't," she said softly. "You'll say it wasn't my fault. Everyone did. The hospital, the board, the parents eventually. But it was. Because I promised her I'd protect her, and I failed. There's no apology big enough for that." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if the cold had finally reached her bones. "After that, I couldn't do it anymore. I left the program, deleted my records, and swore I'd never take another child's trust into my hands again." Ethan swallowed hard, guilt cutting through him. He realized how merciless his offer must have sounded now, buying her help, dragging her back into a world she'd run from. He stepped closer, his voice low. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because people like you don't understand failure," she said quietly. "You fix everything with money, with control. But there are some mistakes that don't have solutions. Only wait." Ethan looked down, rain dripping from his hair onto the wet pavement. "You think I don't know what it's like to fail someone?" Clara didn't respond. He let out a broken laugh, bitter and small. "I failed my wife. I fail my daughter every day. I look at Sophie and see all the ways I couldn't protect her. You think I don't carry that?" She met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw her anger soften, replaced by something like understanding. "Then maybe you understand this," she said. "I can't take responsibility for another child's happiness. I don't have that right anymore." He shook his head. "This isn't about right. It's about need. She needs you, Clara. Not because you're a therapist, but because she trusts you. And that's something I can't give her alone." Clara turned away, shoulders trembling. "You don't know what you're asking." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I know what it feels like to be powerless. And I don't want to live there anymore." The wind carried the faint sound of traffic from the main road, a world still moving forward while the two of them stood frozen in a small, rain-soaked moment. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely audible. "I made one promise I couldn't keep. I won't make another unless I'm certain." Ethan took a careful step closer, lowering his voice. "Then don't promise anything. Don't commit. Just keep showing up." For the first time, she looked at him without the wall in her eyes. The reflection of the diner's neon sign flickered across her face, red and gold against the rain. He wasn't a billionaire now, just a father, standing in the cold, asking for mercy from a woman who didn't owe him anything. Something in her expression shifted, a fragile crack in her armor. "I don't want your house, Ethan," she whispered. "I don't want your money. I just don't want to lose another child." He nodded slowly, his voice rough. "Then help me make sure neither of us does." They stood there in silence. The rain kept falling, washing over guilt and fear alike. For a fleeting second, Clara's hand brushed his as she turned toward her car. Not a gesture of affection, just acknowledgement. Then she was gone. The taillights disappeared into the fog, leaving Ethan standing alone beside the glow of the diner's sign, its flickering letters spelling out something he finally began to believe in again: light. The Willamette looked softer that day. The rain had finally broken, and the air was filled with that quiet clarity that only follows a storm, when everything feels clean, raw, and alive again. Ethan parked farther back than usual, careful not to disturb the small ritual that had begun forming between Clara and Sophie. Every afternoon, the two of them met by the same stretch of riverbank, beneath the willow branches that brushed the water. He didn't approach anymore. He knew better now. From his distance he could see them, two small figures on the wool blanket. Sophie, with her wild hair catching the breeze. Clara still and steady beside her, her head tilted as if listening to something only she could hear. Clara opened the worn sketchbook, but she didn't offer it to Sophie this time. Instead, she folded her hands loosely on her knees and began to hum. No words, no melody anyone could recognize, just a low, rhythmic vibration, a sound like breathing set to music. Soft, circular, safe. Sophie didn't move at first. She sat cross-legged, her eyes following the slow current of the river. Her fingers toyed absently with a blade of grass, twisting and releasing it. Clara's humming continued, calm and patient, rising and falling like a tide. After a few minutes, she let the sound fade. Silence filled the space between them, gentle, not empty. Then she began again, the same tone, the same rhythm. Ethan leaned forward against the railing. He didn't understand what he was watching, only that it mattered. Clara was teaching his daughter the shape of sound, not through words, but through trust. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of river moss and sunlight. Sophie blinked, her head tilted slightly toward Clara, as if something in the rhythm had found its way past the walls around her. The humming continued, and then, so faint that Ethan thought he imagined it, Sophie made a sound. Just a small breath at first, like wind brushing through her throat. Then another, a hesitant note, trembling but real. Clara stopped humming immediately, not to interrupt, but to listen. Sophie went still, startled by the sudden quiet. Then, after a heartbeat, she made the sound again. A little louder, longer this time. It wasn't a word, it wasn't music, but it was hers. Clara's lips parted, eyes shimmering. She didn't smile. She didn't react in any way that might frighten the fragile moment away. She simply breathed, softly, as if to say, "It's all right. You can stay here, in this sound." Ethan gripped thin railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. His chest burned. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to fall to his knees beside them, to hold his daughter, to cry out in joy. But then Clara lifted her gaze toward him. She met his eyes and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't." He froze. The message was clear. Let her own this moment. And so he stayed where he was, trembling with the effort of restraint, watching as the impossible unfolded before him. Sophie's sound came again, short bursts, uneven and shy. She was experimenting, learning what her voice could do, what it felt like to release something into the air and have it not be taken away. It was the sound of rediscovery, the sound of healing. Clara hummed again, softly, matching Sophie's rhythm. Not leading, not guiding, mirroring. It became a dialogue without words, a conversation built entirely of tones and breaths. For a few seconds, the world around them seemed to fade. Even the ducks nearby went silent, as if they too were holding their breath. Sophie's last hum ended with a tiny laugh, a sound so pure and fleeting it almost broke Ethan in half. He turned away, pressing his hand to his mouth, afraid he might start sobbing out loud. After so many years of sterile rooms, failed treatments, quiet despair, here it was. The first sound, not from science, not from therapy, but from connection. He leaned against the railing, his forehead resting on cold steel. He had built a life on control, on logic, on measurable outcomes. Yet the most meaningful thing he'd ever witnessed had come from something entirely unquantifiable, a woman humming to his daughter beside a quiet river. When the moment passed, Clara exhaled slowly, letting the air settle. Sophie went back to her drawing pad and began to sketch. A few wavy lines, circles that might have been ripples, or maybe echoes. Clara sat beside her, eyes soft but distant. For her, the sound had meant something else entirely. It was the moment she'd been running from, the one she swore she would never face again. The moment when a child trusted her enough to speak. And with that trust came fear. The memory of Lily's voice, quiet, trembling, echoed in her mind like a ghost. The promise she couldn't keep. The life she couldn't save. She looked at Sophie now and felt that same fragile thread of responsibility winding around her heart. But this time, she didn't push it away. Instead, she whispered quietly, "You're brave, Sophie." The little girl didn't respond, but her hand brushed against Clara's on the blanket, just a faint, instinctive touch. And Clara understood. That was her answer. Ethan approached only when Clara began to pack up the pencils. "How long has she—" "Just today," Clara said softly, not turning to face him. "It might fade again. It might come and go. That's normal." He nodded, though his throat was too tight for words. "She didn't just mimic me," Clara continued. "She joined me. That means she feels safe. That's the first step toward language." Ethan glanced at Sophie, who was folding the blanket carefully, her rabbit tucked under one arm. She looked peaceful in a way he hadn't seen in years. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. Clara finally met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, shining faintly in the late afternoon light. "Then don't," she said. "Just don't rush her." He nodded again, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The sun had dipped lower, casting gold across the river's surface. Sophie ran ahead toward the ducks, her laughter, tiny, breathy, but real, carrying through the air like a song half-remembered. Clara watched her go, and something unknotted in her chest. She had promised herself she would never hold another child's trust again. Yet here she was, holding it without even realizing, when it began. For Ethan, the sound he'd heard that day wasn't just his daughter's voice returning. It was his own heart, waking up. The Caldwell estate glowed like a glass palace that night. Cars lined the curved driveway, polished until their reflections rippled in the winter light. Inside, chandeliers spilled gold across marble floors, and the air buzzed with expensive laughter, the kind that never reached anyone's eyes. Margaret Caldwell stood at the center of it all, a vision of grace and command. Her gown shimmered silver, her diamonds sharp as frost. Tonight wasn't merely charity, it was theater, a performance staged for every investor, doctor, and whispering member of the board who still questioned whether the Caldwell name could manage its own bloodline. Her granddaughter's silence had become gossip. Tonight, Margaret meant to silence the gossip. "Dr. Pierce," she cooed, greeting a man whose suit alone probably cost a research grant. "We're so grateful you could join us. My son tells me your methods are the most progressive in the field." Dr. Alan Pierce smiled, the kind of professional smile that never bent the eyes. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm confident that with the right regimen and structure, Sophie can make significant progress." Margaret inclined her head, pleased, then turned as her son entered the room. Ethan looked nothing like the sharp, untouchable CEO the press adored. His black tuxedo was immaculate, but his eyes, those gray-blue eyes, held a faint tension, like someone walking into enemy territory unarmed. Beneath him, small fingers curled into the fabric of his sleeve. Sophie. The crowd's murmurs softened as they noticed her, tiny, composed, wearing a pale blue dress that made her look like a ghost of calm. And behind them, half a step removed but radiating something unshakably human, was Clara. Her black dress was simple, unadorned, no jewelry, no designer label, just a ribbon at her wrist and quiet confidence. The light caught her hair in warm brown strands as she followed Sophie, her eyes scanning the room, not with awe, but with awareness. Margaret's smile froze for a second before reforming. "Ethan," she greeted smoothly, "you didn't mention you were bringing company." "She's here for Sophie," Ethan replied evenly. "She's been helping her adjust to new environments." "Oh?" Margaret's tone was almost kind, but everyone in the room recognized the edge beneath it. "And what is it you do, Miss Monroe?" Clara said softly. "Clara Monroe." "Well, Miss Monroe, we're delighted you could join us." Margaret's voice dripped with diplomacy as she turned to a nearby group. "This evening is about progress and partnership, reminding our donors that science and compassion go hand in hand." As if on cue, waiters moved through the hall with champagne flutes. Conversations rose again. Money, medicine, mergers. Clara watched, silent, as people spoke of her like furniture in a room they owned. Ethan leaned slightly toward her. "You don't have to stay long," he murmured. Clara's lips twitched into a small smile. "You mean before your mother decides I'm a social experiment gone wrong?" He stifled a laugh, low and unexpected. It was the first moment of air in the suffocating room. Sophie, meanwhile, stood between them, eyes wide, her hand clutching Clara's. The little girl's gaze darted between faces, each one assessing, calculating, polished. Clara knelt slowly beside her. "Hey," she whispered, "it's just noise. You don't have to listen to it." Sophie blinked, then squeezed her hand tighter. From across the room, Margaret watched. Her jaw tightened. A woman who served tables kneeling on her imported marble floor, comforting a Caldwell heir. It was a tableau she could not allow to last. She glided forward, smile unbroken, her entourage trailing behind like shadows. "Miss Monroe," she began sweetly, "you must tell me, what line of work are you in?" The question carried the weight of silk over steel. Everyone nearby turned subtly toward them. Clara rose gracefully, still holding Sophie's hand. "I wait tables," she said. The air thinned instantly. Even the string quartet seemed to falter for half a note. Margaret's smile didn't waver. "I see. How admirable. It must be rewarding work." Clara's expression remained calm. "It is," she said, "especially when it lets me meet people like Sophie." There was a murmur, a ripple of surprise at her directness. Margaret's tone hardened just a shade. "My granddaughter has received care from some of the most respected professionals in the field, you know. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, Harvard Medical, private clinics in Switzerland. I can assure you she's in the best of hands." Clara tilted her head slightly. "And yet," she said softly, "none of them have heard her voice." That single sentence landed like a dropped glass. The nearest conversation stilled. Ethan's pulse spiked. Margaret's smile fractured for the first time all evening. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat, attempting to restore order. "Progress in such cases is rarely linear," he offered smoothly. "We follow evidence-based—" Clara turned toward him gently. "Evidence is important, but so is listening." Pierce blinked, thrown off by her quiet certainty. "I don't have degrees," Clara continued, her tone steady but not defiant. "I don't have credentials or research papers. I have afternoons by the river, where Sophie hums to the wind and learns she's safe again. And I'll take that over a medical report any day." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum lower, their crystals catching the tremor of tension. Margaret's voice, when it came, was brittle glass. "So that's your contribution, then? Sentiment over science?" Clara met her gaze directly. "Understanding over procedure?" The room held its breath. Ethan watched, heart hammering, half in awe, half in dread. This woman, this waitress he'd found by accident, was standing in front of one of the most powerful women in the state, refusing to shrink. Then, in that fragile moment, something small tugged at the hem of Clara's dress. Sophie. The child looked up at her, eyes wide and steady, her lips parted. A pause, a tiny intake of breath, then, "Clara?" It was almost a whisper, but it was clear. It was deliberate. The sound rolled through the hall like a bell. Every face turned. Sophie's little hand tightened on Clara's fingers. Her next words came slowly, carefully formed. "Stay." The word hung in the air, fragile, miraculous, undeniable. Clara knelt instantly, eyes flooding. "I'm right here, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His mother stood motionless, her perfect posture collapsing for the first time in public memory. The silence that followed wasn't shock, it was reverence. For the first time in 6 years, Sophie Caldwell had spoken. Not for doctors, not for cameras, but for one person who had never asked her to perform, only to be. The music faltered back into motion, too slow, too soft. But the world inside that glittering room had changed forever. Ethan looked at Clara, still kneeling beside his daughter, and thought, "You didn't just heal her. You healed something in me." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell didn't care who was watching. The city outside the penthouse glimmered like a sleeping constellation. After the gala's chaos, silence had weight again, a rare and fragile thing. Sophie was asleep in the guest room, curled beneath a soft blanket, her small arms wrapped tightly around her stuffed rabbit. Every few minutes, her lips moved, murmuring faint sounds, half-formed words drifting through dreams. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of the little girl's chest. The night had been too much, too many lights, too many eyes, too much emotion for a child who had just remembered her own voice. When she was sure Sophie's breathing had settled, she turned off the bedside lamp and closed the door softly. The apartment felt enormous after that, a cathedral of quiet. Downstairs, the refrigerator door was slightly ajar, casting a soft blue light into the otherwise dark kitchen. Ethan was there, sleeves rolled up, hands braced on the marble countertop, staring at nothing. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a man trying to process the impossible. "You should be asleep," Clara said gently as she entered. He glanced up, offering a weary smile. "That makes 2 of us." She hesitated by the counter. "I wanted to make sure Sophie wasn't overstimulated. Nights like this can be a lot." Ethan nodded slowly. "She's peaceful, more than I've seen in years." Clara poured herself a glass of water, the sound of it echoing softly in the vast space. The city lights bled faint reflections across the dark countertops. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that hummed with unspoken truths. Then Ethan said quietly, "You saved her." Clara shook her head. "No, she saved herself. I just gave her space to try." "You gave her safety," he said. "That's not the same thing." She didn't reply. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted the glass. Ethan watched her carefully, seeing something flicker beneath her calm surface, a shadow that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Clara," he said softly, "who was Lily?" The glass stopped halfway as to her lips. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she set it down carefully and leaned back against the counter, eyes far away. "Lily was the first child I ever failed," she whispered. The refrigerator light painted her features in cold, forgiving blue. Her voice was low, but steady, like someone finally allowing a wound to breathe. "She was 6 when I met her," Clara began. She barely spoke. The few sounds she made weren't words, just echoes. She'd been through things I still can't talk about without shaking. But she was bright, so bright. Her lips trembled into a faint, painful smile. "She drew suns, hundreds of them. Every week a new one. She said the sun was proof that light comes back." Ethan said nothing, only listened, the hum of the refrigerator filling the spaces between her words. "She was getting better," Clara continued. "One night her mother called me. Lily had locked herself in the bathroom. She wasn't answering. I thought," her voice cracked, "I thought she needed space, that if we forced the door, she'd lose trust. So I told her mother to wait." Her hands clenched around the edge of the counter, knuckles white. "By the time we broke in, it was too late. She was gone. I told myself it was an accident. The report said it was, but I know better." Tears gathered in her eyes, reflecting the dim light like broken glass. "I didn't just lose her," she whispered. "I lost the right to help anyone again. Because if I truly loved that little girl, and I did, then I destroyed the very world she lived in. Her breath caught, shaky and raw. So, I stopped. I erased my credentials. I walked away. I decided that loving children, loving anyone, was a danger I couldn't afford. The kitchen was silent, but for the faint hum of the city far below. Ethan took a slow breath, his voice barely audible. You've been punishing yourself ever since. Clara laughed softly, without humor. You make it sound like a choice. It is, he said. You chose to build a wall around the best part of yourself. She looked at him sharply, eyes glistening. You don't understand. But he cut her off gently. I do. You're punishing yourself by refusing the very love you were born to give. Her shoulders stiffened, her throat tightening. You think this is about love? It's about responsibility. It's both, Ethan said quietly. You carry guilt because you cared, because you still care. But if you stop letting yourself care, you stop being who you are. He took a small step closer, his voice trembling now. Do you have any idea what that moment tonight meant? Hearing Sophie speak? That wasn't a miracle. That was you. You let her feel safe enough to risk sound again. Clara looked away, blinking fast. Don't make me into something I'm not. Ethan's voice softened. I'm not. I'm seeing you as you are. They were standing so close now that the air between them felt charged, humming with quiet tension. Clara's hand still held the glass of water, trembling slightly. The condensation dripped over her fingers. Ethan's hand brushed the countertop, as if anchoring himself to keep from reaching out. You don't have to be perfect, he whispered. You just have to be here. Her breath hitched. You shouldn't say things like that. Why not? Because if you mean them, she said, voice breaking, I won't know how to stop myself from believing you. The confession landed softly between them, too heavy to move, too fragile to ignore. Ethan's eyes searched hers, and for a long moment, neither of them breathed. The world outside went silent, as if giving them permission. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe believing is exactly what you need. Their foreheads brushed, an accidental collision of gravity and grief. Neither of them kissed. They just stayed there, breath mingling, hearts unsteady. It wasn't passion that held them in that moment. It was recognition, the kind that comes when two broken people realize their cracks fit together like matching lines in shattered glass. Finally, Clara stepped back, breaking the spell. Her eyes glistened, her voice barely steady. I should check on Sophie, she murmured. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. Right, of course. As she turned to leave, he whispered, Clara. She paused in the doorway, silhouetted by the soft light spilling from the hall. For what it's worth, he said quietly, Lily would have been proud of you tonight. Clara froze. For a heartbeat, her entire body seemed to shudder with emotion. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before disappearing down the corridor. Ethan remained where he was, staring at the place she'd stood. The refrigerator light flickered once, then went out, leaving him in the dark. The city was still half asleep when it happened. Outside, dawn hadn't fully broken, just a pale wash of blue brushing the tops of the towers. Inside the penthouse, everything was still, suspended in that fragile hour between night and morning, when even the air seems afraid to move. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, though sleep was too generous a word. His tie hung loose around his neck, his hand resting over his chest, as if trying to steady the rhythm of his heart. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image. Sophie at the gala, her lips forming words he thought he'd never hear again, and Clara, kneeling beside her, glowing in the silence that followed. He hadn't realized when exhaustion finally won. When he opened his eyes again, the world was tinted silver. A faint sound stirred in the hallway, a shuffle of tiny feet against the cold marble floor. Sophie. She appeared at the kitchen entrance, barefoot, her hair tangled from sleep, her stuffed rabbit limp in one arm. The soft hem of her nightgown brushed her ankles. Clara was already there, sitting at the bedside counter, nursing a cup of tea gone cold. She looked up just in time to see Sophie pause in the doorway, eyes squinting against the dim light. Hey, sweetheart, Clara whispered, rising slowly. Couldn't sleep? Sophie rubbed one eye with the back of her hand. Her small fingers tightened around the rabbit's ear. But she didn't nod. She didn't shake her head. She just stood there, looking at Clara, and for the first time, she didn't look down. She looked up, straight into Clara's eyes. It was such a simple movement that at first, Clara didn't realize the magnitude of it. Then she froze. Something inside her, something fragile and ancient, broke open. Sophie took one tiny step closer. Her lips parted. The air seemed to hold its breath. Clara! The name came out like a tremor, small but perfectly shaped. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her body trembling. "Yes, honey?" she managed to whisper, voice shaking. Sophie blinked, her lower lip quivering as she tried to form the next sound. "My—" She paused, the word sticking like it was caught between courage and pain. "My voice." Clara knelt instantly, level with her eyes. "What about your voice, sweetheart?" Sophie's next word came slowly, carefully, like each letter weighed more than she could hold. "Hurts." The syllables fell into the quiet like stones dropped into water, small, rippling, impossibly deep. "My voice hurts." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Clara broke. Her tears came so suddenly, so violently, that she couldn't stop them. A sound escaped her throat, half sob, half prayer, as she pressed a trembling hand over her mouth. Ethan, hearing her, jolted awake. He turned, confused, heart hammering, then froze at the sight before him. Sophie stood in the blue-gray glow of early morning, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight, eyes wide and unafraid. Clara knelt before her, shaking, her tears glinting like glass in the faint refrigerator light. Sophie's words hung in the air, still echoing, fragile, honest, alive. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He took a single step forward, then stopped. He knew better now. This was Clara's moment, Sophie's moment, not his. He turned his face away, pressing a hand to his mouth to silence the sob that threatened to escape. His vision blurred as he blinked hard, fighting the flood of emotion that surged through him. 3 years, 3 endless years of silence. And now, this. Not just sound, not mimicry, meaning. Sophie had described how she felt. She had communicated. Clara reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the child's shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, voice breaking. "That means your voice is waking up. It's just stretching after a long sleep. Like when you haven't run in a while and your legs feel funny." Sophie frowned softly, processing the words. Then she nodded, a tiny, deliberate motion. Clara let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half awe. "You're okay, baby," she whispered. "You're okay." For a long time, they just stayed like that. Teacher and child, healer and healed, kneeling together in the quiet glow of dawn. Ethan leaned against the doorway, barely breathing. He thought of all the therapists, all the specialists, all the clinics, the endless reports filled with jargon and failure, the nights he'd stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was cursed, wondering if his little girl would ever look at him and see him. And now, this. Born not of medicine, but of love. His eyes blurred again as the realization sank deep. Clara had kept her promise. She hadn't bought Sophie's words with money or training. She had given them back to her through patience, through presence. He remembered his own careless words from that first night. "If you can make my daughter speak, I'll buy you a house." But what Clara had done was far greater. She hadn't made Sophie speak. She'd helped her feel safe enough to speak, and that wasn't something you could buy. When Sophie finally wandered back to bed, Clara stayed in the kitchen, wiping her eyes with trembling fingers. Ethan joined her silently, stepping into the soft light. Neither spoke for a while. The world outside was turning silver now, dawn washing away the blue of night. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. She said her voice hurts. Ethan nodded slowly. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Clara gave a choked laugh, the sound somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. "You're impossible," he smiled faintly. "You've been saying that since the first day." She shook her head. "I still can't believe it. After all these years, after everything she's been through, you did that," he said quietly. "You brought her back." Clara's eyes filled again, though she tried to blink the tears away. "Don't say that. You'll make me cry all over again." "Then cry," Ethan whispered. "She earned it. So did you." Something in his tone, so soft, so unguarded, made her look up. Their eyes met, both raw from sleeplessness and emotion. "She's not the only one who's healing, Clara," he said. She looked away, whispering, "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Make it sound like I'm worth saving." He stepped closer, voice steady now. "You already are." For a heartbeat, she couldn't breathe. The refrigerator light flickered, throwing faint halos across the walls. She looked at him through tears, through exhaustion, through disbelief. and saw not the billionaire, not the father desperate for miracles, but the man who had waited for years for a sound he could finally believe in. The sound of love being reborn through a child's voice. The sun had risen by the time Ethan finally spoke again. "You know," he said softly, "you didn't just help her talk." Clara frowned, tired but curious. "What do you mean?" He met her eyes. "You made me listen." And for a moment, the morning was so still that they could hear Sophie breathing in the other room. Soft, even, safe. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. In the quiet light of dawn, two broken adults stood side by side, and the sound that filled the room wasn't pain anymore. It was peace. The morning headlines called the gala a triumph. Photos of crystal chandeliers, gowns like armor, and smiling power brokers filled the social pages. But inside the Caldwell mansion, triumph tasted like bitterness. Margaret Caldwell sat at the head of her mahogany table, her reflection fractured in the polished surface. The silver coffee tray beside her remained untouched. "She humiliated me," she said quietly. Dr. Alan Pierce, seated across from her, shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, Mrs. Caldwell, the child's progress is remarkable. We should be celebrating that." Margaret's gaze cut through him. "You don't understand. She made me look powerless, in my own house, in front of every donor, every board member who keeps this family's reputation intact." Pierce hesitated, then leaned forward, voice low. "If this Miss Monroe is as unqualified as you say, we can easily prove it. There are channels, professional reviews. If she's operating outside legal parameters..." "She's not operating at all," Margaret interrupted coldly. "She's playing savior, and my son, blind with gratitude, is falling for her." Her ringed fingers tightened around a porcelain cup. "I won't have it. Not her, not some waitress pretending to heal what she doesn't understand." Pierce straightened. "Then what would you like me to do?" Margaret's voice softened into something far more dangerous. "Help me protect my granddaughter, officially." A pause. Then, "You want a case," Pierce said slowly. "A formal complaint. One that paints Miss Monroe as unstable." "Unstable and dangerous," Margaret corrected. "And we'll need a witness, someone from her past, someone credible." Her eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "Find me the woman whose child she failed." 2 days later, Margaret Caldwell's black sedan pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the east side of Portland. The houses here were smaller, lined with untrimmed hedges and honest paint. Emily Rhodes answered the door before the driver could knock. She was in her 40s, pale and thin, her expression cautious. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said softly, "I remember your message. Please come in." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that could win elections. "Thank you, my dear. I know this isn't easy." Emily led her inside. The living room was clean but sparse. Photographs of a little girl on every wall. Lily. Margaret sat, crossing her legs elegantly. "You knew Clara Monroe," she began, voice smooth as silk. "My son's acquaintance." Emily's eyes flickered. "Yes, she was my daughter's counselor." "I understand you had a tragic loss," Margaret continued, tone perfectly sympathetic. "I can't imagine your pain." Emily nodded stiffly, saying nothing. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "I also understand there were questions about Clara's judgment, about whether her methods may have contributed to that loss." The room went still. Emily's voice came out hoarse. "What are you asking me?" Margaret folded her hands. "I'm asking you to tell the truth. The full truth. Clara Monroe is spending time with my granddaughter, a vulnerable child. I have reason to believe she's repeating old mistakes." She reached into her bag and slid a folded check across the table. The zeros gleamed faintly in the afternoon light. "We'd like to ensure no other family suffers the same fate. All you need to do is give a statement. A warning, really." Emily stared at the check as if it were something venomous. "You think money buys the truth?" "I think money protects children," Margaret said softly. Emily rose from the couch, trembling. "Get out!" "Mrs. Rhodes, I said get out." Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't waver. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You didn't know my daughter. You didn't know Clara." Margaret stood, regaining composure. "You're making a mistake." "Maybe," Emily said, voice shaking, "but at least it's mine." When the door closed behind Margaret, Emily leaned against it, breathing hard. The check lay crumpled on the floor. She stared at it for a long time before picking up her phone. She had to tell Ethan. That afternoon, Ethan sat in his office, high above the gray sprawl of downtown Portland. The clouds pressed low against the glass, blurring the city into watercolor. His assistant buzzed in. "Sir, there's a woman here. She says it's personal. Emily Rhodes." He stiffened. "Send her in." Emily entered slowly, clutching a small folder to her chest. She looked fragile but resolved. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, "I don't know how much you know about Clara's past." "I know enough to listen," Ethan said. "Please, sit." Emily hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair opposite him. "She worked with my daughter, Lily. After what happened, people blamed her. I blamed her." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I understand." "No," Emily whispered, shaking her head. "You don't." She opened the folder and pulled out several folded sheets, crinkled paper, edges worn, words written in the uneven scrawl of a child. "These," she said, her voice breaking, "were in Lily's room. I couldn't look at them for years, but last month I did. And now you need to see them." She slid the papers across the desk. Ethan unfolded one carefully. The ink had bled from old tears. "Dear Miss Clara, you said I could write when it's hard to talk. Today it's hard. I feel heavy inside, but I don't want Mommy to worry again. You said the sun always comes back. I'm trying to believe that." Another note, shorter, shakier. "Miss Clara, you're the only grown-up who doesn't get mad when I'm quiet. The only safe adult." Ethan's chest tightened. The words blurred before his eyes. Emily was crying silently now. "She didn't kill my daughter," she whispered. "I did. I was so busy trying to pretend everything was fine. I didn't see how much she was hurting. Clara did. She tried, but Lily was protecting me. That's what children do. They protect the people who should protect them." She wiped her face roughly. "Mrs. Caldwell came to me today. She wanted me to say Clara was dangerous, to help her build a case." Ethan's jaw hardened. "She offered you money." Emily nodded. "But I couldn't. Not after reading those letters. Not after realizing Clara was the only one who saw Lily. Not as a patient, not as a problem, but as a person." She pushed the last note toward him. The handwriting was barely legible. "Thank you for the sun, Miss Clara." For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the faint rush of traffic far below. Ethan folded the letters carefully, reverently, as if they were made of glass. "Thank you for bringing these," he said, his voice low, thick with emotion. Emily nodded. "Please don't let your mother destroy her. Clara's already punished herself more than anyone ever could." "I won't," Ethan said. "I promise." As Emily left, he stood at the window, the papers trembling in his hand. Outside, the gray sky had begun to break, revealing a sliver of pale sunlight cutting through the clouds. He looked down at the letters again, those trembling, childish words that had outlived their writer, and realized that redemption didn't erase pain. It simply gave it somewhere to go. The storm returned the same evening Ethan made up his mind. Rain lashed against the windshield as his car wound through the old forest road that led to the Caldwell estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade lit by flashes of lightning, grand, proud, and hollow. He hadn't been here in months, not since the last time his mother tried to orchestrate his life like another one of her charity galas. But tonight, there would be no performance. He walked through the double doors without waiting for the butler to announce him. Margaret Caldwell sat in the drawing room, framed by firelight and rain. A chessboard lay untouched on the table beside her, its pieces frozen mid-battle. She looked up when he entered, the faintest irritation crossing her perfectly composed face. "Ethan," she said, tone clipped but elegant. "I didn't expect you so late." He closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate. "I'm not here for a social call." Something in his voice made her straighten. "Then by all means," she said, setting her glass of wine aside, "let's get to whatever this is." Ethan walked closer, stopping by the edge of the Persian rug that had witnessed generations of Caldwells win and lose power. His reflection flickered in the rain-streaked window behind her, tall, rigid, the image of control he'd learned from her. Only this time, the control wasn't hers. "I know what you did," he said evenly. Margaret's expression didn't change, though her fingers tightened around the chair's armrest. "You'll have to be more specific. I do a great many things." "You went to see Emily Rhodes." A pause. The sound of thunder filled the silence. "I spoke to a grieving mother," Margaret replied smoothly. "Someone who deserved to be heard." "You offered her money to lie about Clara," Ethan said. His tone stayed calm, but the restraint in it was sharp enough to draw blood. To testify that she was negligent. To destroy her. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I was protecting you, protecting Sophie. That woman has a history of endangering children. Or did you forget?" "I didn't forget," Ethan said quietly. "But you did." Her brows drew together. "Excuse me?" He stepped forward, pulling a small envelope from his coat. He set it on the coffee table between them. The faint scent of rain clung to the paper. "These," he said, "are Lily's letters." Margaret's eyes flicked down into the envelope, then back to him. "What is this supposed to prove?" "Everything," Ethan said. "The girl Clara couldn't save didn't die because of her negligence. She died because she loved her mother too much to tell the truth. Emily showed me these. She came to me crying, begging me not to let you turn Clara's grief into a weapon." He opened the envelope, unfolding one of the fragile, tear-stained pages. His voice broke slightly as he read aloud. "Miss Clara, you're the only grown-up who doesn't get mad when I'm quiet. The only safe adult." He looked up. "That's what Lily wrote. The only safe adult." Margaret said nothing. Ethan's tone hardened. "The woman you're trying to destroy is the same one who brought Sophie's voice back. She didn't do it for money or recognition. She did it because she saw our daughter when no one else could." Margaret rose slowly, fury rippling beneath her composure. "She's manipulating you. That's what people like her do, cling to wealthy men for validation. She's a waitress, Ethan, a waitress pretending to be a savior." Ethan's face remained calm, but his eyes darkened. "Then tell me why she refused my money. Why she turned down a house. Why she risked reliving her own trauma just to help a child she'd never met." Margaret blinked, thrown off balance. "A house?" "Yes," he said. "I offered her one, in exchange for helping Sophie, but she refused, said she doesn't sell miracles." He took a step closer, his voice steady now. "So, you're wrong, Mother. She's not chasing our name. She's running from hers." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. The fire crackled loudly in the quiet. "You always told me," Ethan continued, "that power meant protecting what matters. But somewhere along the way, you forgot what that was. You think control is love. You think appearances are legacy, but all you've done is build a world so polished no one can breathe inside it." He paused, his voice lowering. "I'm done suffocating." Margaret's chin lifted, pride instinctively reasserting itself. "Don't speak to me like I'm your enemy." "I'm not," he said softly. "But if you keep doing this, I will be." Her voice sharpened again. "You'd really throw away your family name over a woman who serves coffee?" Ethan's answer was almost tender. "Yes." The word hung there, solid and irreversible. He leaned forward slightly. "Because she's the first person who's ever reminded me what it means to be one." Margaret's composure cracked. "Ethan," he didn't let her finish. "If you don't stop this, you'll lose me, and you'll lose Sophie. No more visits, no more dinners, no more Caldwell legacy, just silence." The irony wasn't lost on him. Silence had haunted their family for years, Sophie's, his own, and the emotional silence his mother had perfected. But now it would be her turn to live with it. Margaret's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't dare." Ethan took the remaining letters from the envelope and placed them gently on the table. "Try me." The room went deathly still. Outside, rain struck the windows in hard, uneven rhythm. For a long moment, Margaret just stared at the letters, the ink blurring under the glow of the chandelier. She looked smaller somehow, less the iron matriarch and more the woman she used to be before grief hardened her into stone. Her hands, always so steady, now trembled slightly as she reached for the papers. "You're choosing her," she whispered. "I'm choosing peace," Ethan said quietly. "And you can still have that too, but not if you keep trying to control it." The words landed like a benediction, and a warning. He turned toward the door, but before leaving he looked back. "You taught me to fight for what I believe in, Mother. I just never thought I'd be fighting you." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the marble corridor. Margaret sank back into her chair, staring at the letters. The rain pressed harder against the glass, blurring the view outside until the world itself seemed to dissolve. For the first time in decades, she felt something she couldn't suppress, silence or outmaneuver. Fear, not of scandal, not of headlines, but of losing the only family she had left. Spring had arrived quietly along the Willamette. The sky was still soft with drizzle, but the world had begun to bloom again. Tiny bursts of white and blush scattered through the willows, the scent of wet earth rising like memory. The river, no longer gray, shimmered faintly under the thin sunlight. Ethan parked on the familiar gravel road and stepped out, holding an umbrella in one hand and a folded wool blanket in the other. Clara followed behind him, her hair loose, damp from the mist. Sophie skipped ahead, her boots splashing in shallow puddles, laughter rippling through the cool air. It was the same spot, the same old riverside bench, the same concrete ledge where the first blue circle had been drawn. Clara stopped when she saw it, her breath catching. "You remembered," Ethan smiled. "I never forgot." He spread the blanket over the damp ground, the same blanket she had carried all those months ago. The edges were frayed now, the red threads faded, but it still looked like safety. Sophie plopped down in the middle, clutching her stuffed rabbit, grinning up at both of them. Clara laughed softly. "She's bigger. She's louder too," Ethan said, pretending to wince. "I've learned that's a good thing." Sophie tilted her head. "Daddy funny." Ethan froze for half a heartbeat, then broke into a laugh that sounded freer than it had in years. Clara smiled, watching him, her chest tight with something that wasn't quite pain anymore. For a while, the three of them just sat there, watching the ducks, the slow current, the faint blossoms drifting like white paper across the river's surface. It felt like a full circle, except this time, no one was broken. Ethan turned to Clara. "There's something I've been meaning to give you." She looked puzzled as he reached into his coat pocket, a small velvet box, and beside it, a single silver key on a chain. Her hands went still. "Ethan, what?" He took a slow breath. "When I first met you, I made an offer I thought was generous." Her brow furrowed, but she didn't speak. "I told you that if you could make my daughter speak again," he continued, voice low, "I'd buy you a house, like a prize for performing a miracle." He looked down at the key resting in his palm. "But that was arrogance. I thought love could be measured by contracts and conditions. I thought healing was something I could pay for." He met her gaze. "This isn't that. The house isn't a reward, Clara. It's a place, a foundation, a home where the three of us can stand together without anyone owing anyone else." He opened the box. Inside wasn't a ring, just a simple wooden pendant carved into the shape of a small sun. Clara stared at it, the meaning sinking in like sunlight through clouds. "You kept her drawing," she whispered. "The blue sun." He nodded. "You said once that circles mean things come back around. I think that's what this is, coming back, not to get where we were, but to where we belong." Her throat tightened. "Ethan." Before she could find the words, a small hand tugged at her sleeve. Sophie had scooted closer, her big brown eyes serious, her rabbit dangling between them. "Clara?" she said softly. Clara smiled, blinking away tears. "Yes, sweetheart?" Sophie's tiny fingers slid around hers. She looked up at her father, then back at Clara. Her next words came slowly, careful, and deliberate. "Mom, stay." The world stopped. Clara's lips parted, a silent gasp breaking from her chest. Her tears came before the sound did, a sharp, trembling sob that dissolved into laughter halfway through. Ethan looked away, his own eyes bright, jaw clenched to hold back the emotion. Clara cupped Sophie's cheek with shaking hands. "Say it again," she whispered, smiling through the tears. Sophie giggled, proud of herself. "Mom, stay." And then she reached for both of them, her small hands grabbing Ethan's and Clara's, pressing them together in her lap. Ethan's fingers curled instinctively around Clara's, warm and steady. The three of them sat like that for a moment, hands joined, breaths uneven, the sound of the river blending with Sophie's soft laughter. Clara couldn't speak, not yet. But she didn't need to. The word mom still echoed in her ears like a hymn. From a distance, someone stood beneath the trees, watching quietly. Margaret Caldwell, no pearls tonight, no tailored coat, just a shawl and a bouquet of spring lilies in her hands. She didn't move closer, didn't speak. She simply watched her granddaughter laughing by the river, her son's arm draped protectively around the woman he loved. For once, Margaret's face wasn't hard. It was tired, softened, maybe even humbled. She knelt near the path, set the bouquet down. a quiet apology made of flowers, and turned to leave. Farther up the trail, another figure waited. Emily Rhodes. "Thank you for coming," Emily said quietly. Margaret nodded, eyes still glistening. "You were right," she murmured. "Some grief can only be mended by watching someone else find their peace." They stood there in silence for a long moment, as the rain began to fall, light, cleansing, almost warm. Back by the water, Clara brushed a damp curl from Sophie's forehead. "She called me Mom," she whispered, almost in disbelief. Ethan smiled faintly. "She called you what she's known all along." Clara laughed softly through her tears. "You really don't play fair, do you?" He shook his head. "No, not when it comes to keeping my family." Then more quietly, "I don't need anyone else to define it anymore. Not the board, not my mother, not the world. This is my family. If you'll say yes." She blinked, startled. Yes to what? He placed the key in her hand. Yes to staying. The key gleamed faintly in the drizzle, resting against her palm like a promise. Clara looked down at it, then at him, and then at Sophie, who was now humming softly to herself, her voice clear and sweet. Clara's tears fell again, but this time they weren't heavy. They were light. She reached out and placed the pendant, the little wooden sun, around Sophie's neck. "You brought back the light," she whispered. Ethan leaned close, his forehead touching hers. "You both did." They stayed like that as the rain softened, as the world around them glowed in shades of green and silver. The air smelled like new beginnings. Sophie tilted her head up, smiling at the sky. "Rain sounds happy." Clara laughed quietly. "That's because it is." Ethan wrapped an arm around both of them, pulling them close. 3 voices, 3 heartbeats, 1 promise.